Hello, students. Happy Friday. I hope you guys are having a great day today. So today we're doing an online lecture because I am feeling a little under the weather. I know you guys are bummed. You're welcome for letting you guys sleep in today. You didn't have to wake up early, so I guess that was a plus, right? Okay, so today we will be going over chapter 11, which is social psychology. Since I am not looking too good, I'm going to keep my camera off. And so social psychology can be defined as psychology that is concerned with social influences on thought, memory, perception, and other cognitive processes. And what we're looking at here is how humans behave within a social context. I don't know if you guys remember, but a few weeks ago we talked about different perspectives of psychology, and social psychology was one of them. And we specifically talked about how different how problems within a social psychology framework are viewed in a social context, and is going to be at the individual level and also at the societal level as well. But today we'll kind of expand on some of the stuff we touched bases on in previous weeks. So we'll talk about first social identity. And so when we think of social identity, we can think of who we are and kind of why we are the way we are, what we think and why we think the way that we do, right? It's our worldview, our kind of epistemology, some might say. So each of us develops a social identity based on the groups that we belong to. And I have some examples noted here, right? It could be our nationality, it could be our religious affiliation, it could be our ethnicity, our political background, or our occupation. So these are just a few examples of the social identities that we carry. And as you can see, all of us carry multiple social identities, right? We don't just identify with one of these groups, we identify with multiple groups. So we all have several social identities, and these identities are usually something that we're proud of, something that we're emotionally attached to. And in a lot of ways, these identities determine how we view the world and how we conform to rules, values, and norms. And we'll talk about values and norms and rules in other slides, and your textbook also talks about it as well. But for now, we'll just talk about one social identity and what that is. And so, our identity, as I said, is something that we feel proud of usually, and something that we're emotionally attached to. Um, so I'll give you an example, right? So let's say all of us go to CBU or went to CBU. I'm an alumni. So you might be really, really proud of that. You might have CBU gear. Like I know my mom has some CBU, I think a t-shirt or mug or something. And I have some gear as well, some alumni gear. So that's kind of showcasing my pride, right? Or if you see people with pictures and they have kind of the Lancer L sign up with their hands, or making that sign, that could be a sign that they're really proud of that social identity as well. And so more often than not, your textbooks notes that people are tend to be emotionally attached and proud of their social identity. So another way you might see that, another example might be if somebody's a Christian, they might have like a Jesus loves you sticker on their car, or they might have the church they're affiliated with on their car. That's going to show you that they are proud of that social identity. So now we'll talk about in groups and out groups. And so every social identity we have creates an in group, which in turn creates one or more out groups. And so let me give you an example. So like, let's just say we'll stay with Christianity since we were already talking about that. So let's say that one of our social identities is being a Christian, right? So that social identity then becomes our in group. It's our in group. That's the one that we identify with. And then everything else outside of that group, it becomes our out group. That's our out group. So let's say other religious affiliations such as Protestantism, Jews, Muslim, Buddhist. So those are going to be our out groups. We don't identify with those groups. And then the in group would be the group that you identify with, and the out group is the group that you don't identify with. Now, even like say we wanted to narrow it down even further, there are so many sectors of Christianity. So say that somebody identifies as an evangelical Christian. So then there's other sectors of Christianity, such as we have Catholicism, Protestantism. There's so many sectors. So if we wanted to narrow down, we could say the in group, like let's say, was an evangelical Christian, and then all the other out groups were all the other sectors of Christianity. So that would be another way to look at it. And the text also talks about in-group favoritism. So this is the tendency for people to be more generous with fellow members of their own group over members of other groups. And so somewhere you might see this at would be you can see this in like athletics. I know a lot of the students here in this course are athletes. And so your team, whatever team you on, that's going to be your in group, and whatever team you guys play against, that's going to be your out group. And so we can see that a lot in competitive sports. So let's say, for example, somebody's a Yankees fan. So the Yankees would be their in group. And then all the other sports teams, baseball teams outside of the Yankees are going to be the out groups. And you can see that, so more often than not, the Yankees fan is going to have a favoritism towards the Yankees over other baseball teams, right? So that's going to demonstrate the in-group favoritism. And that's something that happens it happens all the time. It happens everywhere. So I'll give you another example. I don't know if any of you guys are familiar with the movie Mean Girls, right? You remember the scene when Gretchen says, you can't sit with us, right? So she's in that scene, they are the in group, right? And everybody else outside of that group is the out group, right? And she's saying, no, you can't sit with us. And she favors her group over other groups. And so your book talks about this us versus them mentality, and how people develop that favoritism. And you can see it right away when people start referring to their in group as us and out groups as them, right? They tend to perceive themselves as, I want to say better, but they have a favoritism, definitely an in-group favoritism towards their group over the other group. And so one way to reduce this group conflict is to promote interdependent mutual goals. And so one of my favorite books is by C.S. Lewis. It's called Mere Christianity. And he talks about the different sectors of Christianity and how they can kind of live in harmony and kind of have a better relationship if they focus on their mutual goals, right? So as C.S. Lewis would put it, right, we're all Christian, we all believe in Christ, and he would talk about some of the common doctrines that all of the sectors of Christianity have, versus focusing on the differences. He chooses to focus on the similarities and the mutual goals that we have. And so that's one way that the text talks about that people can reduce conflict, is by focusing on interdependent mutual goals. Okay, so next we will talk about attributions. So, according to the attribution theory, people seek to explain their own and other people's behavior by attributing causes of that behavior to a situation or a disposition. And so it gives you a little example here. So we'll see an example of a situational attribution would be Joe stole my money because his family is starving. So here we're basing Joe's action on a situation, versus a dispositional attribution. Joe stole my money because he's a born thief. And so you can see here the difference, or one of the differences is one of them is talking about is not necessarily blaming Joe or attributing Joe's actions towards himself as a person, right? They're saying, oh, well, it's situational, he did what he had to do because he was starving. Maybe they're justifying, maybe they're saying, well, maybe Joe wouldn't do it if he wasn't starving. If he had just eaten, he probably wouldn't have stolen money. Or under normal circumstances, Joe wouldn't have stolen money. In contrast to Joe is an awful good for nothing thief, right? Here we're kind of attacking the character of the person here, and we're attributing their behaviors to their being instead of a situation. So some of another example that your book talks about is a person being mean and crabby, right? And so you can choose to look at it from a situational perspective of like, oh, maybe they're just under a lot of pressure at work. Maybe they just had a newborn baby and they're not sleeping enough. Maybe they're having some financial problems. So here you can see we're kind of giving somebody a little bit of grace. We're not really attacking their character, versus the dispositional attribution, where we might say something like, oh, she's super involved and clueless, or she's unfriendly, she doesn't care about anybody but herself. So that would be more of a dispositional attribution. And you can see this a lot, like in therapy with couples. So I'll often see this with couples, right? And you'll see that, you can kind of tell, right, when a couple is, newlywed and they're still in the honeymoon stages, because they will more often than not use a situational attribution, right? So they're still in this honeymoon phase. So they're like, oh, he's just crabby because he's tired, or, she's just crabby because she hasn't slept because, she just had the baby, things like that. But then if we talk about, usually if we see couples who have been together a little bit longer, they'll tend to demonstrate more dispositional attribution, right? And so they will tend to be more critical, more judgmental towards their partner. Another example might be parents that I've seen with parents and their children. So I've seen that. So an example would be, say I have a young adult who is still kind of living at home with mom, and they're not really contributing, and maybe they don't have a job and they're not going to school. And so sometimes in the beginning, right, it's like the parent will kind of give their child some grace and like, oh, they're just trying to find themselves, or they're just going through a hard time right now. That they'll say, something like that. Or maybe like somebody just passed away, so they're mourning, so they're giving them some time to figure their life out and get a job. Or I know one parent said, that their child got a divorce, right? So they're like, okay, they need some time to pick up and get off their feet, right? So, but then after a little bit of time goes by, then that situational attribution sometimes will turn into a dispositional attribution, to where, that's when we start critiquing more harshly, right, towards the person and not the situation. And maybe then it starts to be like, oh, so and so is a good for nothing, lazy, um, yada yada, right? It goes that direction versus a situational attribution. Um, so we're also going to talk about social forces. Your book, the text talks about in 2020 how we had the COVID-19 pandemic, and how that was a real life-changing thing for a lot of us, for globally, actually, everybody, right? Not just the US. Um, but it was really a life-changing thing. But one of the things that we realized during that pandemic is that we are social beings. We are tribal creatures, and we naturally want to gravitate towards being with others. And it's not necessarily like what we realized is, even though some of us may identify as um introvert or extrovert, and maybe the introverts don't require as much social activity as the extroverts. What we did discover is that we all want some sort of social activity, some more than others. But we are social beings. And I give you an example of that. Like for maybe for an introvert in the beginning stages of COVID, it might have been fun for a while, right? It's like, okay, well, it's not, I don't want to say fun, but maybe it wasn't so bad, right? Um, and then but after some time, right, it's going to start being wearisome, and you're going to want to have some contact with people. So an example of that might be in the film Castaway with Tom Hanks, right? So um after first being alone, no big deal, but after a while he has to create Wilson, right, with a volleyball, because he needs some sort of companionship. So that's a good example of social forces and how we are all social beings. And next, we'll talk about social norms. So norms are the rules and expectations that regulate social life, including explicit laws and implicit cultural conventions. And so when we think about norms, we think about the way that people are expected to behave. There's this expectation that people behave a certain way, and certain environments have certain rules, right? You wouldn't behave the way that you behave in a church, at a bar, and vice versa, right? There are certain rules and expectations to all of these different environments that we interact with frequently, right? And so you'll see that just like we talked about our social identity, within those social identities we conform to particular social norms, right? So I'll give you an example. So I know that in class usually, so if this were an in-person lecture, usually I like to start off and with prayer. And that's become, now that I've done it so many times, it's probably become a social norm. You expect that when I'm going to start a lecture, I'm going to start that lecture off with prayer, right? Because I've done it so many times now, it's become an expectation. And most of you guys will follow that expectation, right? I don't usually hear very many people, I've never had anybody reject to that, right? And because we're at CBU, and because when you part of the school, the institution, as goals are Christian integration, right? CBU specializes in Christian integration. So that's something you would expect in that environment. That may not be something that you would expect to do in other environments that you're in. And so that can be and that's considered a norm, right? It's something that you expect. Now, in that example, that's not an explicit law, right? Nobody's going to go to jail if they don't pray. But it's so then it's more fitting towards a cultural convention. And so we also talk about the violation of norms and how that can be embarrassing and lead to social isolation. So to stay with the example that we're on, so say that there are some students who, even though they attend CBU, maybe they don't identify as Christian. Maybe their parents are making them come to this school, and they don't really want to pray, but they also don't want to say anything about it. They're like, they don't want to not fit in and be different, right? So they kind of conform to that norm, even though they're not necessarily, and that's not something they necessarily want to do, because maybe they don't want to be embarrassed about it. So most of the time people get embarrassed when they violate a norm, or it can also lead to social isolation. So when people see others violating that norm, they might go, "Ooh, that guy's weird," or "that person is different," and they may not want to socialize with that person because they violated that norm. One of the violation of norms your books talks about is a cowboy streaking in Times Square in New York City, and getting kind of odd looks from civilians just kind of walking down the street, right? They're like, "What is wrong with that guy?" So that would be an example of somebody violating social norms. It's not normal for somebody to just go streaking and running around Times Square. Next, we'll talk about the bystander effect. So the bystander effect is finding that when people are around, it becomes less likely for an individual to come to offer assistance to someone in need. And this is a really interesting concept, because you would think that this wouldn't be the case, but it is. And one of the explanations for it is because of the diffusion of responsibility, the tendency for members of a group to avoid taking action because they assume that others will. And so I'll give you an example of this. So I used to be a marriage and family therapist trainee at Riverside City College. And I remember they made all of us get certified in CPR. And is because the school had, it was set up very interesting. It had they had mental health and physical health all in the same building. And so they offered medical services with staffed nurses, and then they also had therapists there as well, mental health clinicians. So we were all like in one hub, in one building. And I remember one time, well, I remember getting my CPR certification, but it wasn't something I was, looking forward to like ever utilizing, right? And I remember there being a time where somebody fainted, and everybody ran obviously to the person, right? They want to know, well, what's going on. And so it stirred up a crowd. And I remember myself thinking, because I had this CPR certification, like, "Oh no, now I'm gonna have to do CPR." And I remember within, the blink of an eye, within the snap of a finger, being relieved that, first of all, that person didn't need CPR. And then second of all, even if they did, there was a lot of nurses around, so I probably wouldn't be the one to do it. So that it gave me some relief. I didn't really realize it at the time, right? It was an example of the bystander effect, right? Me actually being not wanting to help because I'm like, oh, thank goodness there's somebody else here that knows how to do that. I don't have to be responsible for that, right? There's a bunch of nurses here that can do that. And so that would make me less likely to help because I know, hey, there's somebody else here and they can take care of that. And as far as I'm concerned, they're more medically trained for that than I am. But so that is an example of the bystander effect. Now, if we look at it through the opposite end, right? Now, if nobody was around, then my conscience would probably eat at me, right? I'd have to be like, oh man, nobody's here, so I guess I have to do it, right? There'll be no other alternatives. I would have to, even though I might be a little uncomfortable about it. I would more than likely still help the person if they needed CPR, if there was absolutely no other option. But because there was more people there, then I diffused that responsibility to them. All right, so now we're going to talk about why people obey. So obviously we do, this is just kind of now we're going to kind of wrap up what we learned here. And so social psychologist studies challenge the notion that bad behavior always results from bad apples. Rather, research suggests that a variety of social forces, including norms and roles, can shape the behavior of ordinary people in both positive and negative ways. Right. And so now let's kind of digest all of that, right? So it's not necessarily that people's decisions are all well, from this framework, right? They're not biologically based. They're based on social influences, right? And these social influences really impact our day-to-day lives. And so this can kind of help us with our relationships because we can look at them through that lens. And sometimes if we look at them through that lens, we can develop more compassion and more kindness and empathy for people, right? And so in the therapy world, like a lot of times when we're working with parents, they'll say something like, oh, you know, he's just so bad, my child's so bad, and or they'll say the name of their child and they say blank is so bad, Steven's so bad, right? And so we talk about it changing and reframing that to the behavior is bad. Their behavior is bad, but the person is not bad. And so if we look at that, as we mentioned, right, from a sociological perspective, right, we can say, okay, we understand why people act the way that they do, and we can therefore establish, you know, more empathy for them. And then hopefully we can have like maybe more situational attribution versus dispositional attribution towards others. All right, guys, so that's it. We're all done for now. I will go ahead and post a short quiz with a few questions based on this lecture, and I hope you guys have a fantastic and beautiful weekend.